Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Pat Higgins. I'm the president and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. I've paid these people to sit in the front row. Good to see you guys. It is such a pleasure to welcome you for our 6th annual Mittelman-Berman Holocaust Education Series. First, today, November 11th, is Veterans Day. This evening, I'd like to take a moment to recognize and thank the men and women who have served, fought, and paid the ultimate price so that we may remain free. November 11th, thank you. November 11th, 1918, originally known as Armistice Day, was supposed to mark the end of the war to end all wars. But sadly, this was not the case. Many more brave American men and women have been called upon to fight in wars since then. To all veterans, on this day, we honor your courage in times of adversity and your dedication to preserving our democracy. Ralph Hockley, one of our local survivors of blessed memory, always, and a veteran, liked to remind us, freedom is never free. So thank you all for your service. Next, I'd like to thank our incredibly generous supporters of the Mittelman-Berman Holocaust Education Series, Julie Mittal-Berman and Dr. Joseph M. Berman. Julie and Joe, your support of the museum, this series, and Holocaust education in our community makes such a huge difference, and we are very grateful. We'll hear a few words from Julie and Joe in just a minute, but I'd like to also thank our community partners for this program, ADL Texoma, Jewish Federation of Greater Dallas, Southwest Jewish Congress, and the Texas Holocaust, Genocide, and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission. Thank you all so much for your steadfast support of our institution and of our programming. And, as always, I'd like to thank our board members who are with us this evening, our museum members, our generation members, and our volunteers. We could not fulfill our mission without your support and your tireless work, and we are very, very grateful. If you're in the audience and you are not one of those, in one of those 4 categories and would like to get involved, please let one of us know. Go to our website and find out how to become a member or a volunteer. Or if you are a 2nd or 3rd generation of a survivor, please connect with us so we can get you involved with generations. So I'd love now to invite Julie and Joe up to give welcoming remarks. I wanted to let you know that we are incredibly honored tonight to have Joe with us for his first public appearance following a major stroke. This program is so important to them because it honors their family, and it really was important for Joe to be here. So please help me welcome Julie and Joe.
Thank you for coming today. Welcome to the annual Mittelman-Berman Holocaust Education
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out tonight for this annual Mittelman-Berman Holocaust Education Series. My husband and I created this series to ensure that Holocaust education will always be available for future generations. Each year, we try to bring a speaker who will bring relevance and inspiration, who will educate and alert us, and most importantly, keep our collective family's memory remembered and honored. We created this series in memory of my parents, Magda and Laszlo Mittelman, of blessed memory, both Holocaust survivors. Tonight's speaker will be speaking about how one man, Fritz Bauer, dedicated his life to make Germany and Nazis accountable for the Holocaust. He did it at a time when the world wanted to leave the past in the past. But as we see, the past has come back. We are living in a time of cultural denial and rampant misinformation. A new generation of uninformed, uneducated, and ignorant youth are marching towards fascism, with anti-Semitism once again being the element that unites them. The staff here at the museum works tirelessly to educate and inform, but clearly there's a lot more work to be done. We want to thank the Holocaust Museum staff for helping us in making this event possible, and Mr. Fairweather for making the trip to Dallas and speaking about the Prosecutor and the lessons we can learn from this timely book. Thank you very much.
Julie and Joe, thank you so much for your passion and commitment to our mission and your generosity. Tonight, we have the pleasure of hosting journalist and best-selling author Jack Fairweather, as Julie just said. Before I introduce Jack, I'd like to take care of some housekeeping. As always, we will have time for questions from the audience. Hopefully you got the note cards when you came in. Please write your cards on the note card and raise them, and our staff will come around and collect them, and we'll answer as many as we can. If you're joining us virtually, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to type and submit your questions. And I'd also like to ask you to take a minute to silence your cell phones and other electronic devices so we can enjoy the program without disruptions. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Jack Fairweather is the author of The Prosecutor, One Man's Battle to Bring Nazis to Justice. His previous books included The Volunteer, the best-selling account of Witold Pilecki, a Polish underground officer who volunteered to be arrested so he could report on Nazi crimes in Auschwitz. If you've been through our Holocaust wing and our permanent exhibition on the third floor, you'll find Witold Pilecki in the Poland Gallery on a red panel because he was an upstander. Jack has served as the Daily Telegraph's Baghdad bureau chief and as a video journalist for the Washington Post in Afghanistan. His war coverage has won a British Press Award and an Overseas Press Club Award citation. We are very honored to have you here, Jack.
Good evening, and thank you so much for those kind words, Mary Pat, and also for Julie and Joe Berman for making all this happen. I hugely appreciate the chance to share with you tonight the story of a really extraordinary man, and special thanks also to Caroline and Izzy for facilitating all the logistics. I'd like to start by asking you to imagine a history of the 20th century in which the Holocaust is only a footnote to the Second World War, where the encyclopedia entry for Auschwitz describes the flourishing chemical industry in the nearby town, but doesn't mention the gas chambers, where school textbooks describe Hitler as, quote, gifted in a variety of ways, and conclude that, quote, no more than 100 people knew about the Holocaust. This isn't an abstract thought experiment, but West Germany in the years following Hitler's defeat, when the Holocaust was all but forgotten and the Allies sanctioned the return of millions of former Nazis to forge a new country to serve as a bulwark against communism. It was time, in the words of the West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, to, quote, let bygones be bygones. This is the world to which Fritz Bauer, the subject of my new book, The Prosecutor, returned in 1949. So picture the scene. Bauer, on a train entering Germany at the Danish border, on his way to take up a job as a prosecutor. He's 45 years old, a small man in a neatly tailored suit with a careworn look. He had once been the youngest judge in Germany and a rising progressive voice in the Weimar Republic. He's also gay and Jewish and incredibly lucky to survive. Bauer is looking at the other passengers, wondering who's killed or watched others kill. For Bauer, these are pressing questions, not just because of the dangers he faces returning to a country that tried to kill him, but because he's seeking justice. The Allies believe that's been served at Nuremberg, when 22 men were convicted of war crimes in 1946. Robert Jackson, the American chief prosecutor at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, declared in 1945 that only Hitler and his inner circle could be considered responsible for the Nazis' crimes. A few thousand more trials and Nazis were sentenced in follow-up proceedings. Bauer is staggered by the number of perpetrators who walk free. 8.5 million Germans had joined the Nazi Party. 250,000 had served in the SS, which had operated death camps like Auschwitz. And yet most had simply slipped back into German society as if nothing had happened. Bauer has got a radical idea. He plans on using the justice system to force a national reckoning. By prosecuting Nazis in the courts, he hopes to hold their crimes up to scrutiny and expose the roots of Nazism in German culture. What were the chances of Bauer achieving that? One of Konrad Adenauer's first acts upon becoming chancellor in 1949 is to appoint as chief of staff Hans Globke. Here he is in his Nazi uniform, and here he is in Adenauer's chancellery. Globke was one of the main implementers of the Nuremberg race laws. His express purpose in the new republic is to reintegrate former Nazis into society and draw a veil of silence over the past. He has at his disposal a spy network of former military officers and ex-SS men set up by the CIA to battle the Soviet Union, but which Globke is using to crush dissent and keep his crimes and those of others out of the courts. Somehow, Bauer is going to have to persuade the West German judiciary, itself stacked with former Nazis, to hear his cases and convince an exhausted nation to listen. I think we take for granted our knowledge of the Holocaust as it's taught in schools and commemorated each year. But to join Bauer on that train in 1949 is to realize a different future was possible. For the past 5 years, I've been researching and writing The Prosecutor. It's the story of how one extraordinary brave man sought to bend the arc of history towards justice, and in the process, established the Holocaust in our collective conscience. I first came across Bauer, while writing my previous book, The Volunteer, excuse the brief plug, about Witold Pilecki, a Polish resistance fighter who infiltrated Auschwitz to report on the horrors of the camp. Pilecki's story raised the question of why the world looked away from the crimes of the Nazis. But Bauer asks us a different question, one that I think speaks to us in our particular time now. What made the world confront the Holocaust? How do you change a culture that's in denial about its past? And how do you persuade people to recognize their own intolerance and prejudice? Let's rejoin Bauer as his mission begins in the small German city of Braunschweig. 90% of the town center has been destroyed by Allied bombing. Half the city is living in temporary accommodation. No one wants to talk about the past. The chief of police is a former SS officer from Krakow who'd overseen deportations of Jews and Poles to Auschwitz. The first thing Bauer needed to do was establish the facts. Little was known about the Holocaust in the first years after the war. It wasn't even called the Holocaust. The history books by the likes of Leon Poliakov and Raoul Hilberg had not been written. What's more, the scenes of some of the worst crimes, and much of the evidence was behind the Iron Curtain. Here's a map I'm sure you're all familiar with, the division of Europe into East and West, and of course, all of those death camps behind the Iron Curtain in Poland. Holocaust information was instead being used as a weapon of the Cold War. The East German secret police, the Stasi, combed through the archives looking for records to use as part of a propaganda offensive against the former Nazis and Adenauer's government. The West Germans responded by dismissing the accusations as communist fabrications and smearing anyone who used the information as a Soviet stooge. In his early years in Braunschweig, Bauer was limited to prosecuting local Nazi crimes. Earning rancor and abuse, some colleagues openly stated he should have been gassed, but also finding allies in the judiciary and within the Social Democratic Party, the main progressive opposition to Adenauer. In 1956, Bauer was appointed Attorney General of Hesse, one of the largest and most liberal German states. The job gave him more power. He would manage about 200 prosecutors from Frankfurt, the country's financial capital, and the center of an economic boom fueled by Reconstruction. But what Bauer realized he needed was a trial capable of breaking through the silence. A few months into his tenure, he looked through the file of war criminals that the Austrian authorities wanted to hand off to West Germany, and he spotted a name you will all recognize: Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann had been missing since the end of the war. Bauer immediately saw the potential of a trial to expose the entire operation of the Holocaust if he could track Eichmann down. There was no telling where in the world he might be hiding, and Bauer knew that even if he found him, should he seek to have Eichmann extradited to West Germany, the former SS man would almost certainly be tipped off by the West German authorities and helped to escape. In desperation, Bauer holds a press conference to announce his investigation. So it was that 7,000 miles away, in a poor neighborhood of Buenos Aires, a blind German Jewish survivor is having breakfast one morning while his teenage daughter, Sylvia, reads him the newspapers. There is Lothar and his daughter, Sylvia. There's a small piece in the newspaper about Bauer's hunt for Eichmann. The name is familiar to both because Sylvia has been dating a boy called Nick Eichmann, who had come round to dinner one evening and declared, not realizing they were Jewish, that Hitler should have finished off all the Jews. Was the surname a coincidence? The survivor wrote to Bauer, and Bauer recruited him and his 14-year-old daughter to track down the SS man's hiding place. And I think if you want to get a sense of the world in which Bauer was operating, it's just worth pausing there for a moment and considering he couldn't contact the West German police. He couldn't contact the Argentine police for fear of Eichmann getting tipped off. Instead, he had to use a blind Holocaust survivor and his teenage daughter to track down Eichmann. It was Sylvia who courageously knocked on the door to Eichmann's house and asked the middle-aged man who answered it, "Are you Nick Eichmann's father?" Bauer then enlisted Mossad's help to kidnap the former SS man and bring him to Jerusalem. Here he is, finally, in his cell awaiting justice. The subsequent trial in 1961 of Eichmann was every bit as impactful as Bauer had hoped. Survivors who for so long had had their experiences disbelieved or dismissed were finally given a platform to speak. One of those witnesses was a 46-year-old Ukrainian-born Jewish woman named Rivka Yoselevska. Here we have some of the extraordinary footage of Eichmann from the trial, and in a moment you'll see Yoselevska take to the stand. And again, this is just one of those extraordinary moments. I will paraphrase what she says, and you can imagine her incredible courage in speaking these words, facing Eichmann. She was the sole survivor of a massacre outside Pinsk, Belarus. She had been due to appear the previous week, but had suffered a heart attack, and against her doctor's orders, she insisted on taking the stand. She described how the SS brought her, together with her 9-year-old daughter, her family, and several hundred Jews from the local ghetto, to a pit in the forest clearing. They were ordered into rows, and then the shooting began. Yoselevska approached the edge of the pit, her daughter clinging to her side. "Who shall I shoot first?" one of the guards asked. When she didn't answer, he seized Yoselevska's daughter and fired at point-blank range. Then he grabbed Yoselevska by the hair and pulled the trigger, and she toppled forward, but the bullet had only grazed her skull. I think you'll agree with me, looking at these images, you can see some of that raw emotion coming across. It was that courage of Yoselevska that finally, and other witnesses I should add, that finally succeeded in cutting through public indifference and compelling global attention. But Bauer didn't want to stop there. He saw the Eichmann trial as an opportunity to take on the former Nazis running the West German state. In particular, Bauer wanted Eichmann to speak from the stand about his work with Konrad Adenauer's right-hand man, Hans Globke. There you see a picture of Adenauer in the background, and there is a former implementer of the Nuremberg race laws, his right-hand man, Globke. What followed was an extraordinary Cold War battle, which I tell in the book, to try and keep Globke's name out of the Jerusalem trial. Globke enlisted his spy network to destroy compromising documents. They placed Bauer under surveillance. Bauer's phone line was tapped and ran through the night with calls. Konrad Adenauer himself threatened Bauer that he risked being, quote, dragged into the shadows. I'd like to pause for a moment and just consider the situation that Bauer found himself in 1961. It wasn't only the oppression of the state that Bauer was struggling with. He saw a society in West Germany that remained deeply intolerant. Camp survivors were treated with suspicion. Anti-Semitism was rife. This was a swastika graffiti campaign in the late 1950s. This is the synagogue in Cologne. What's more, Bauer couldn't live openly as a gay man. This is an extraordinary fact. The Allies stripped out almost all Nazi-era laws from West German statute books, except those targeting gay men. Bauer was profoundly alone. The more I discovered about his solitary life, the more I found myself wondering what pushed Bauer to set himself against the West German state. It was easy to see where his anger came from and how it drove his desire for justice. But what made him believe reform was possible? And if it wasn't anger that drove his mission, what was it? I knew the answers lay in a private life that Bauer, for very good reasons, had deliberately kept hidden. I was delighted, therefore, when my researcher Sina in Copenhagen found an extraordinary cache of letters in the Danish archives. Bauer fled to Denmark in 1936 after 3 shattering years living under the Nazis. The letters he wrote came from friends and family in Stuttgart. Some were written in code to hide identities, although they hardly needed to because of the state of the handwriting and the fact that half were written in archaic German script known as Sutelin, which for any German readers or Sutelin readers, here it is. It turned out even my brilliant German researcher Ingrid could not make head nor tail of these letters. But then she had a bright idea, which was, let me give them to my 90-year-old mother, Hedy. And here is Hedy earlier this year, and she received in Germany a giant box of these letters from the archives and set about translating and, well, transcribing and helping us translate them. And it was a very poignant moment, I think, for all of us, because actually Hedy had grown up under the Nazis. Her dad had been an administrator in Nazi-occupied Poland, and so the thought that 80 years later, this daughter of the Nazis would be helping piece together the inner life of one of the great Jewish heroes of the Second World War was very impactful. The letters that Hedy helped us translate pointed to an extraordinary moment for Bauer. He had left Nazi Germany in 1936 and found himself in Denmark, in one of the most liberal countries in Europe, where homosexuality among adults over the age of 18 had been legalized a few years before. And for the first time in his life, Bauer could live openly as a gay man. One of the men he lived with was Paul Wagner. And my researcher Sina tracked down Paul's daughter, Hella. And there I am, there she is in her living room. I was there sitting opposite her and had one of those moments that every biographer dreams of, in which Hella said, oh, you know what? I think I've got a box somewhere up in the attic of dusty old letters. And up she went and brought them back down. And they were letters by Bauer, describing in beautiful, playful, vulnerable, intimate detail his relationship to Paul. And it was a relationship that nurtured Bauer's sense of who he was and what the world could be like, stripped of bigotry and hatred. It was a relationship that also saved Bauer's life when the Nazis occupied Denmark in 1940. It was Wagner who shielded Bauer and his family, and in 1943 helped them escape to neutral Sweden from the small Danish port of Rørvig. And I just want to show you a little bit more of the process of putting together the book. This is the sort of thing I love to do as a historian. I'm sitting there with a local historian, Babe Brostrup, and you can see Hella in her red jacket to the right. The other 3 ladies there were the granddaughters of the family that sheltered Bauer in Rørvig, and great danger to the family because there was a Nazi garrison just 100 meters away, and Bauer and his family had to live in a broom cupboard in the house for almost a week whilst the family tried to find a fisherman to take them across the Öresund to Sweden, neutral Sweden, and safety. And sitting with that family, they sort of helped us piece together the route that their grandmother and Bauer's family had taken from that house to the coast. And it was on that very beach that Bauer and his family finally escaped the Nazis. And I got to take one of the few World War II era fishing boats across some of the Öresund with a local fishing captain. And this is a very touching moment captured in this photograph. That's Bauer's great niece, and whose dad was on that boat. He was a little boy who was rescued, and she's holding onto the arm of the son of the fishing captain who rescued them all. And they never met before, and it was just wonderful to bring them back to that beach and introduce them to each other and connect the two sides to the story. It was in Stockholm, in Sweden, after escaping the Nazis, that Bauer began to put together his experiences of persecution with the sense of community he had found in Denmark. Germany must have a national reckoning, Bauer wrote in January 1944. That meant looking beyond the crimes themselves to the culture that had aided and abetted Nazism. It was only by breaking down those old values of authoritarianism and conservatism, Bauer believed, that he could be sure that Nazism would not return, and that maybe his homeland could accept him for who he was. That's the vision that Bauer carried with him onto the train in 1949 as he headed back to Germany. That's the vision that drove Bauer to track down Eichmann. And that's what inspired Bauer to confront Germany with Auschwitz in 1963. And I'd like to pause again for a moment to just put ourselves back into the way the world thought in the early 1960s. It's extraordinary to imagine for us today, but Auschwitz hardly featured in public debate back then. Bauer began to conceive of a trial that would put the camp itself at the center of proceedings. The Eichmann trial had been important for raising public awareness about the Holocaust, but in focusing on Eichmann, it had allowed Germans to hide behind the denial that the killing was only the work of a few. Bauer's idea was to indict the ordinary Germans who had operated the camp, the guards, the orderlies, a doctor, a pharmacist, the camp dentist. He wanted his countrymen to see themselves in the dock. He also wanted to make the point that no defendant had acted alone. They needed a camp, a community, a culture to support them. In December 1963, the Auschwitz trial of 22 defendants began in Frankfurt. Here we see a picture of the opening day. And you can see the defendants are sat behind those desks. And here is two of them. In the foreground is the head of the Gestapo in the camp. And behind him in the shades is a man called Victor Capacius. Victor Capacius, respectable pharmacist of the small German town of Göppingen, also pharmacist of Auschwitz, who supplied gas to the gas chambers and pilfered gold dentures from his Jewish victims. Over the next 18 months, over 350 witnesses from a dozen countries took the stand in Frankfurt in what was one of the greatest criminal trials in German history. And what was to be a sensational moment of Cold War drama, Bauer's team pressured the West German government into allowing the court to visit Auschwitz itself, along with a delegation of reporters. You may remember that map of divided Europe, Auschwitz firmly behind the Iron Curtain in Poland, communist Poland. So when those reporters visited that delegation, it was one of the first times that any journalists from the West had been allowed to report en masse from the camp. So this image here that will be so familiar to all of us, the gates of the main camp to Auschwitz. This is a photograph taken by a West German photographer. When this was front page across West German dailies, when it was front page and across Western Europe and Britain and America, people had never seen this image before. They didn't know what those words meant. Likewise, here was the court visiting that infamous gatehouse in Birkenau. Again, another image completely seared into our collective conscience, but for viewers of TV, there was a TV cameras there as well. I'll show you in a minute some extraordinary footage. This was the first time that people had connected the gas chambers of Auschwitz to the idea that the place actually existed. And this is the court now visiting with the press one of those gas chambers, blown up in 1945 by fleeing SS men, but nonetheless still extant. And the court and journalists stepped down the steps into what remained of the gas chambers. And these images were broadcast all around the world. Auschwitz is no longer somewhere in Poland, far away, noted the journalist Bernd Naumann, a West German, who was part of the delegation. Auschwitz has come close to us. So I describe the remarkable impact of the trial, inspiring a new generation of Germans in the 1960s to confront the crimes of their parents and lead a social revolution. So we're all familiar in America of what 1968 meant, that huge social upheaval. The same thing happened in West Germany, except it had this extraordinary impact because Bauer had shown young students who attended the court of the Auschwitz trial, he had shown them what their parents did. And that question that had not been asked until then was suddenly being asked for the first time. What did you do in the war, Dad? What did you do, Mum? And that was the way in which the 68 generation began to play out in Germany with dramatic effects. And Bauer lived to glimpse some of the world he was fighting for. Adenauer and Globka left office in 1963, and in the years that followed, students and young people began to find their voice, staging protests against the Vietnam War and police brutality. A bill was tabled in the Bundestag calling for the legalization of homosexuality. The Holocaust, as it had finally started to be known, found its way into school curriculums. This is one of the last photographs taken of Bauer. He died alone in his apartment in July 1968. He was just 65 years old. I think you'll agree with me from this picture, he looks very much older. He died probably from a heart attack as a result of years of overwork and stress, and the doubt he always had that the revolution he had helped spark wouldn't last, or the reckoning wouldn't go far enough. I think some of Bauer's fears have proven well-grounded. We can see that in the last German elections, in which 1 in 5 Germans voted for the far-right AfD, which is openly critical of what it calls the, quote, guilt cult surrounding the Holocaust. And I found it too in my own research in Germany. I was struck by how many families of perpetrators continued to insist that Nazism was the crime of a few. So you may remember Globka. I got to meet his children, Werner and Marian. They recognized the horrors of the Holocaust, but told me they thought their father had been helping Jews through his promulgation of the Nuremberg race laws. Axel Eiser, the grandson of the pharmacist of Auschwitz, recognized that the camp was terrible, but Eiser insisted that his grandfather had, quote, only been following orders. Eiser still operates his grandfather's pharmacy. There it is, funded by Jewish gold from Birkenau. This is why Bauer's story is so important for us today. Because each generation must struggle with the Nazis' crimes. Bauer believed that the strength of democracy, the guarantee that Nazism will never return, lies not in the lines society draws, which Bauer knew could be breached, nor in institutions which he knew could be corrupted. Rather, it lies in our personal commitment to confront the past and struggle with its meaning. In a time when Holocaust denial is on the rise and minorities are under attack by those in power, that's never been more important. Thank you very much.
Here we go. I think we all wish you had continued speaking, Jack.
Wow.
That was riveting. You talked to us about the reality of the lack of knowledge about the Holocaust before his work, Bauer's work. Have you thought further about what and I've heard you say that we take for granted our Holocaust education today. Have you thought about, without his work, what our future might have been like? What would we be speaking about genocide? What would have happened to the other developmental human rights laws that came about in response to the Holocaust?
I really try to make the point in the book that Bauer is so central to our reckoning, not just in Germany, but collectively. It wasn't simply Nazis who didn't want to talk about the past. So many survivors, of course, did not want to dwell on the trauma of their experiences. I'm sure many of you have families that grandparents, parents whom struggled to talk about the past for long years. And Bauer gave a platform to survivors to speak. And he believed that the truth of their experience would change us. And it's such a powerful message. It's so simple in some ways. Give a survivor a stage and their truth will change the world. And it really did. And I think, I like to think, Bauer played a huge role, of course, in Germany, but I think he's a very unrecognized hero of a battle which we don't really know about, because when I was taught Holocaust history in schools, it was, this is the past. This is,
right.
This is like big history, World War II, okay, and you can answer some questions on it. And Bauer helps connect the Holocaust to our own time, because he reminds us that the fight to acknowledge the Holocaust, to come to terms with that huge crime, is an ongoing battle. His whole life was a battle to acknowledge the Holocaust. And when you realize that battle, starting with Bauer, you see how it connects to our own time, and of course our own time now, when we are suddenly beginning to have to recognize that, yes, we have to fight for this history.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how Bauer and his family fled Nazi Germany? How did they get there? Did they have family or friends that enabled them to go to Denmark? Or?
Well, Bauer's brother-in-law
I'm sorry. Don't forget to raise your questions if you have them. Volunteers. Caroline, do we have volunteers coming up and down? I see a couple. Excuse me, Jack. Go ahead.
Bauer's brother-in-law was able to get a permanent residence visa and encourage Bauer himself to move to Denmark. Bauer went as a political asylee. What's so fascinating about his story, and it makes this part of the book so gripping, is the fact that Bauer's dad was a World War I veteran, someone who volunteered to fight for Germany. He believed Hitler's promise that no Jewish veterans would be harmed. He didn't want to leave. He was like, I back Hitler. He was a right-wing, conservative Jewish businessman who just did not want to believe what was happening around him. He had Bauer, who was he was one of the very first people seized by the Nazis in Stuttgart, because he had been a sort of activist and a campaigner. He was top of the Gestapo list to intern. He went straight to a concentration camp. In fact, because he was one of the very first to be taken to a concentration camp, the Nazis hadn't quite sort of figured out the full scale of their sort of racial horror to come, and so he got released. But as soon as he was released, he was like, "Dad, let's go," and his dad didn't want to. And in the end, Bauer faced this agonizing decision. He traveled to Denmark and realized that this was this extraordinary place, and he couldn't persuade his parents to leave. He does manage to rescue them, but I will ask you to read the book to find out how.
Come on, Jack. All right, and there will be books for sale in the bookstore, in our museum store after this for autograph. Now we all want to go home and read, right? Let's see, you mentioned the letters that Hetty helped translate and Paul's daughter's letters. You also used newly declassified German records in your research. Can you share how you came across these and what was your process for getting access to the records? The first treasure trove you found.
Right. Well, I mentioned that Globke had at his behest this spy chief who was a man called Reinhard Gehlen, and he was Hitler's spy chief in the East and had a sort of full purview of the Holocaust by bullets as it was unfolding. He was a military officer, and he was a very canny operator. He took all of his Nazi records, ran off into the Alps, waited for a month or two, and then approached the Americans and said, "Your big enemy isn't the Nazis anymore, it's the Soviets, and I've actually got files on all of the Soviet bigwigs and all of their military operations. You need me."
Wow.
And the Americans said, "Yes, possibly we do," and brought him on, put him on their payroll, and he set about hiring the same network that he had used under Hitler. And that organization that Gehlen founded went on and is now the West German Federal Intelligence Service, which is the main intelligence service in Germany. It has been a battle for decades by historians, by journalists, to get documents declassified to expose the Nazi past of this organization. Not so much the crimes of some of the SS men who were employed, but actually their role in shaping things like the Eichmann trial. Like, it is extraordinary to think that the Eichmann trial, I mean, I'm sure you know the history of the trial and you've seen those images of Eichmann, but what you don't know is this incredible Cold War battle behind the scenes with West German spies trying to control and stop Eichmann speaking from the stand about Globke. And so these records have begun to be declassified. We got some, my German researcher got some in a shoebox, somewhat in strange circumstances. It's also the case that the previous head of the BND, the Federal Intelligence Service, he had a whole bunch of files on a man called Alois Brunner, who was Eichmann's right-hand man, led the mass murder of Greek Jews and many others, and he was employed by the BND for a time. And those files, when it was finally, the BND were finally beginning to declassify them, mysteriously were destroyed. At some point during an IT change in the 90s, apparently, which is just sickening, really, when you think about it, because it's not like Alois Brunner, we care about his feelings, and his children, we shouldn't care about their feelings. Right. We should care about getting to the truth, and which is hard to do. So there's still work to be done. A huge commission was finally given access to some of the German intelligence files over the past decade, and I got to work with some of those brilliant German historians to help tell this story.
What drew you to this project? You're so passionate about it. What caught your attention and drew you in?
Well, I as you mentioned, was a war reporter, and I spent a decade in Iraq and Afghanistan embedded with American and British troops, and I ended up quite burnt out talking to a war reporter friend of mine, and he had just come back from Auschwitz, and he had seen an exhibition there which mentioned Witold Pilecki, not by name, just that there was a resistance cell in Auschwitz, and I remember being so struck by that idea, and that brought me to Pilecki's story some years later, and I wrote a book about it. And it was whilst compiling the list of characters at the back of the book, I was looking through all of the perpetrators of the camp, and wondering what had happened to them. Pilecki, inside Auschwitz at the height of the Holocaust, was smuggling out reports telling the world what these men were doing, what happened to them. And, I was struck by the fact that most went on to live comfortable post-war lives, doing the very jobs they had done in the camp. The pharmacists of Auschwitz became the pharmacists of Göppingen. Doctors who had done the selections continued as doctors in their practices. And there was one common denominator, though, running through their stories, which was the fact that although it took 2 decades, it was Fritz Bauer who finally brought them to justice. So then I was like, oh, who is this man? Pilecki didn't know, they didn't know each other, but there was there's this sort of way in which there was a call for justice, and it did get answered with great difficulty.
We may have to have you back to talk about Pilecki, right? Let's see. Can you speak to the power of the liberation footage and images that came out of the camps and how they aided the prosecutors in giving out sentences to Nazi leaders? A lot of that liberation footage was held, even in Great Britain, right, until the last
no, it was
decade or
It was
so.
incredibly powerful because, the Nazi regime had put out through the wartime years Allied propaganda, there's nothing to see here, nothing's, the camps are being well run, and then suddenly it was impossible to deny the horror. But what I think is so important to grapple with is that I think, like everyone in this room, when you think about post-war justice, you think of Nuremberg, and then you think, yes, justice delivered,
right.
And it was against those 22 Nazi leaders, but it didn't begin to address the scale of the crime or its specific anti-Semitic and direction. The Holocaust did feature, but it was seen as a sort of part of the general crime of the Nazis, and that's why for someone like Bauer it was profoundly unsatisfying, and it took the Eichmann trial to bring out finally the Jewish dimension of the Holocaust and bring the world's attention to bear.
Can you share that for those who might not be familiar with Eichmann, his fate?
Well, he was in 1962 he was executed, and that throughout the course of the trial, he put forward the argument that he was only following orders. In fact, through the reporting of Hannah Arendt, gave us this idea, the banality of evil, which I think has been quite criticized subsequently because it makes it sound, it takes away the sort of particular agency of Eichmann in the mass murder. And it was something that Bauer himself, he actually met Arendt, and they had a bit of a disagreement over this.
Oh, interesting.
Because he felt that didn't explain what had happened at Auschwitz. It was a little bit too easy, and he really wanted Germans and the world to look at what it was that made ordinary people mass murderers, and that's what was so compelling and extraordinary about his trial, because it was easy to dismiss, in some ways it is even today, Eichmann as an ideologue, a Nazi fanatic, someone just twisted by hatred and ambition. And what is so much more disturbing in a way is to see people like Victor Capacius and the others who stood trial and begin to analyze what made them kill. And that's one of Bauer's great gifts to us is pushing us to confront what ordinary Germans.
Right, ordinary men. Let's see. There's another question about Eichmann and about the process to extradite him from Argentina, working with Mossad. So he really had to go to Israel for the trial. There was no way that could have happened in Germany.
There was no way
because of his connections,
right,
correct?
There was no way that could have happened in West Germany, and indeed the German embassy in Buenos Aires was staffed by former Nazis, and they ran a sort of unofficial rat line. In fact, there was a circular put out by the West German Foreign Ministry called Alert that helped warn former Nazis in countries whether they might be subject to arrest. So there was no place but for Israel. What I think you will find very compelling about Bauer's story when it comes to Eichmann is the fact that when he approached Mossad in 1957 saying, I know where Eichmann is, Mossad said, well, you know what, we're not that interested, thanks. And, there are reasons, of course, for that. Israel was fighting for its very survival at that time. And the Mossad director, Issa Harel, didn't see the value of digging up the past. They didn't want to think about how Jews had been victims, and they wanted to consider a new sort of Israeli national identity as heroes fighting for their independence. And it was quite, Bauer went away and, did some more work with Lothar and his teenage daughter to try and dig up records and land offices, and went back to Harel, and Harel, he sent someone to go and have a look, but when he actually went to the address that Bauer had identified and was like, oh, this is too, the mass murder of Europe's Jews must be living in a palace, can't possibly be his home, and didn't even spend more than 5 minutes investigating. Bauer went back to Israel. By the way, all of his meetings with Issa Harel top secret, because you can imagine in the context he was operating, a West German official colluding with a foreign spy agency to arrest a German or Austrian national. He would have been fired, and that would have been the end of his mission. He went to see Harel and said, if you don't take action and take this seriously, I'm going to go to the press. And maybe Eichmann will then escape. Maybe I will get fired, but you will have to answer to questions in Israel as to why you took no action to bring this man to justice. And there's a little note in Ben-Gurion's diary about a meeting with Issa Harel in which he recounted this showdown with Bauer. And Ben-Gurion just notes, do what Bauer wants. And that's it. And then, of course, then we know the story, right? We've watched the film, and there's that incredible, not to then in any way detract from that incredible operation that Harel put together, but just fascinating to think that it wasn't just West Germany, it really was this kind of global struggle to come to terms with the Holocaust in Israel as well as elsewhere.
Was it well known at the time? Was Bauer's involvement well known, or was that hidden until?
No, that was kept secret throughout his life.
Throughout his life.
And
okay.
And it's one of the reasons why he is. For decades after his death, he was largely forgotten in Germany. And it's actually sad to say, although there was this kind of bigger cultural shift that he ignited taking place, when it came to actual prosecutions of Nazis in the courts, that just shifted right back again to the default, which was paying no heed. There were a few more trials, of course, but nothing. You can actually track Bauer's impact once he sort of arrives in Frankfurt from like less than 20 trials of Nazis up to about 5,000, and then it drops right back off again once that energy of this man leaves the system, because he couldn't change the fact that most of the judges he was working with were former Nazis who had implemented the Nuremberg race laws and other taking part in judicial murders. And
was there someone helping him though higher up? I mean, he couldn't have.
So
I guess he could have done it alone.
So that's a really good question, and I, of course, as you may be able to tell, quite taken by Bauer, and really think his intellectual brilliance and his role in the Holocaust should be more widely recognized. He was, of course, working with other activists, with other political figures. He was hired by a man who was the premier of Hesse, this German state, who was himself an anti-Nazi, a social democrat, and who helped to protect him up to a point. And with that showdown over Globke and Adenauer, in the end, he had to actually back down. And but I think what I found, very compelling about Bauer's story is, of course, he was alone, both, in this system and in his personal life. But what you see him doing is just constantly reaching out and trying to connect with people, to bring those survivors to Frankfurt to speak. I mean, just think of that for a moment. I mean, who would want to go back to Germany to testify in a courtroom, standing as close as we are from the people who killed your friends and family? He needed to build up a network of survivors. He worked with an amazing Austrian man called Hermann Langbein, who was a survivor himself and a huge early educator who was trying to make Auschwitz be reckoned with, and he talked survivors into coming to take the stand. Bauer talked to young people, gave so many interviews and spoke to so many. And one of the stories I tell in the book is the closest thing in Germany, in post-war Germany, that Bauer came to finding something like love and companionship, and it was extraordinarily with the son of the Nazi regime's top film director, a guy called Veit Harlan, who some of you may know the film Jud Süß, which was like the top anti-Semitic propaganda film used by the regime. Every SS man had to watch this film, compulsory viewing for Nazis, and his son, Thomas, had, at the end of the Nazi regime, had a turning against his father, a turning against what the Nazis were, and he put on a play, an amazing play actually, in Berlin, staged in Yiddish, about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and which is quite just extraordinary. This was in the early 50s, and at the end of the 50th show, he got onto the stage and said, "Thank you all for coming. By the way, did you know that there are Nazis in the current West German government?" And he read a list of all of, like, Globke and all the rest to the audience.
This is the son.
This is the son. And what happened? He was summoned by the police, brought into the theatre was filled with lawsuits. Young gangs of sort of right-wing students attacked it with stink bombs. And it was just it's a really great story. He was challenged. He was threatened to be sued. Like, how can you accuse these people of being Nazis? People. And he was like, "All right, I will get evidence." And he went across to Poland, one of the very first to ever from the West to ever visit the Polish archives, and he began digging up all this evidence, and this is indeed how Bauer got so much of the material he needed for his trials, because of course Thomas Harling came in, he didn't know what to do with it. He just had all these stacks of evidence. He started writing to prosecutors in West Germany saying, would you be interested in this? And of course everyone was like, no, not really. And then of course the letter arrived at Bauer, and he was like, you know what? This is just what I need. And, and so this amazing friendship and this sort of father-son, but also sort of romantic in a way, began to form between the two men. And really, it was an example to Bauer, because this was all happening in the 50s, not a decade before the student revolution. And it was, like a little seed of hope for Bauer that he was on the right track.
Inspired him, What do you think, is this my final question? Oh, I'm looking at Caroline, it's my final question. We could go on and on. What do you think is the most valuable lesson from Bauer's journey that we can all take with us tonight?
That's a good ending question.
It's a hard one, isn't it? But
it's a really hard one. I think one part of it is that connections that Bauer made, and I think in dark times, maybe like our own, it's quite easy to feel you're sort of scrolling through the news on your phone and you end up feeling quite alone and sort of doom laden, and that is really not a sort of, doesn't fill you with agency, and yet everyone is having that experience. And I think Bauer was so good at connecting people and connecting that young film director son with people like Herman Langbein, the gatherer of witnesses, with a young prosecutor who was able to make a trial happen. And so that ability to connect is so important. And the other thing I take away from Bauer's story, and it is a little bit edifying for us today, so brace yourselves, but Bauer, when he went back to Germany, he brought hundreds of Nazis to the stand, and towards the end of his life, he wrote an essay and just noticed not a single one ever recognized their crimes. Not a single one looked at the victims or the witnesses and said, I'm sorry for what I did. And
that's chilling.
And that was very galling, as a human being, to realize that people cannot see that change, just recognize the need to change their views. But what Bauer realized, of course, and this is why his trials were so impactful, it wasn't about the Nazi in the dock. I mean, of course it was, and it's great that Eichmann got captured, but it wasn't simply about Eichmann. It was how his story was going to spark that change. And he was really viewed the court as a piece of theater, and the audience was beyond the walls of the courthouse. It was those young people who were connecting to the story of the Holocaust, hearing the survivor voices, and changing profoundly Germany. And so the takeaway for us today in our own darker time is of course there are those who are fighting the good fight in the courts today to protect institutions, protect public office. However, it's also a bigger struggle that we have to connect with, and that's why I sort of think you will find Bauer's story resonates so much when you realize, that big vision that he had, that long-term idea that he had, and how he went about implementing it.
Well, and the power of one person to change history, and to really shape how we know history.
Yes.
Is encouraging.
It's encouraging, and I like history that speaks to me, and I think biography is a very powerful way of doing that. And what I'd like to try and do is bring people into Bauer's life and help you understand his choices as he made them. And in fact, not to sort of help people understand why was Globka brought back into government? What did Globka think about his role in the Nuremberg race laws. How can we understand the past? And I think the best way to do that is to have a blazing story that doesn't make you want to stop reading and that compels you to follow it through to the end.
I think you have just encouraged people to come to the audience and buy your book. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much. Jack, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Julie and Joe, thank you so much for making this possible and for your commitment to the museum. Thank you for all being with us. Jack will be signing books in the lobby, and I think the bookstore may still be open. And so if you haven't gotten your book, please run to the store and buy one. Thank you all. Good evening.
Thank you.